This program covers the diagnosis and repair of the 5-speed transmission fitted to the Vega, Monza 2+2, and Monza Town Coupe. This is the second of 2 programs about this transmission. For basic disassembly and reassembly information, refer to the update program 75U5. The Chevrolet 5-speed transmission has proven both durable and reliable. It is not only lightweight, but also economical to operate and has a sporty connotation. Because 5th gear is an overdrive, the output shaft turns faster than the input shaft. For a given speed in 5th gear, the engine does not turn as fast as a conventional direct drive final ratio. This gives the 5-speed transmission potential as a real fuel saver. The 5-speed transmission is a modern design. An enclosed single-rail shifter eliminates external linkages and protects the mechanism from hard shifting caused by dirt, rust, and corrosion. Another feature of this manual 5-speed transmission is that Dexron automatic transmission fluid is recommended. Despite the 5-speed design, troubleshooting procedures are basically the same as for other manual transmissions. This is because the transmission gears and synchronizers are of conventional design. In diagnosing the 5-speed transmission, the service advisor must first verify the complaint, road test the vehicle, and make sure the customer's complaint is understood. There are 4 major areas of complaints pertaining to transmissions. They are leaking, jumping out of gear, noisy operation, and hard shifting. Once you have identified the major complaint, try to get more specific information by testing the vehicle. For example, if the customer's complaint is noisy operation, find out in which gears the noise can be heard. Now let's take a look at the first kind of complaint, leaking. The most common causes for leaking are listed here. If the case must be resealed, remember that a formed-in-place gasket material is used and must be cleaned from the mating surfaces carefully if a leak-free repair is expected. Let's look briefly at each of these leaks. If the front seal is leaking, oil will appear at the front of the case near the bell housing dust cover. A slipping clutch may be caused by a leaking front seal. Next, inspect the extension seal for leaks. This seal can be replaced with the transmission in the car by withdrawing the yoke. Check the center section. If there is a leak, tighten the bolts and road test. If the leakage still persists, you may have to remove the transmission and reseal the joining surfaces between the main, center, and extension housings. It is essential to clean the mating surfaces completely before trying to reseal the transmission. Any debris left from the old gasket material will certainly cause a leak. Check the speedometer-driven gear O-ring for signs of leakage. If there is a leak, replace the O-ring. The ring can be replaced with the transmission in the car by removing the gear housing. The second kind of complaint about transmissions is jumping out of gear. There are several different reasons why a transmission may jump out of gear. The most probable causes are listed here. You can start to troubleshoot for jumping out of gear by checking the shift lever for unusual looseness or binding. Test shifting in and out of each gear. Because there is no external shift linkage, any repair must be made with the transmission disassembled. However, you can diagnose the probable cause of the complaint by noting the way in which the transmission jumps out of gear. If the shift mechanism is binding or not allowing the gears to engage fully, there will be a stiff, short action of the lever. If there is excessive movement, the shift pivot ball may be loose or broken. This kind of difficulty tends to affect shifts into all gears equally. A worn interlock will also cause generally poor shifting. If the shift forks are worn, there will be a poor engagement for the pair of gears operated by the fork. These gear pairs are selected by 3 forks: reverse and first, second and third, fourth and fifth. For instance, a broken 2-3 shift fork will probably not affect a reverse first or 4-5 shift. If the poor shifting seems to be restricted to 2 gears in the same vertical slot, a damaged shift fork may be indicated. A bad synchronizer will probably affect only 1 gear. The gear may shift easier when hot than cold. A worn synchronizer can be overridden by skillful double clutching during a downshift. Jumping out of gear can also be caused by failed or worn parts. Again, the problem gear will indicate the area to inspect when the transmission is disassembled. Whatever the diagnosis, the transmission will have to be disassembled to correct any of the faults discussed so far. After disassembly, check the shift rail forks and fork links for signs of damage. Check the pads on each fork for wear. Make sure the nylon pads on the forks are not worn or broken. The nylon pads should be a snug fit on the synchronizer sleeve groove. Check the synchronizer clutch sleeves for burrs, nicks, or scores. Make sure that they slide properly on their hubs. Check the fit of each gear on the main shaft. Inspect the needle bearings for wear or damage. Also check that the tapers on the synchronizer teeth are not damaged. The third complaint we will discuss is noisy operation. It is important to know exactly when the noise occurs. The service advisor should test drive the car with the customer to verify the complaint. During the test, he should note in what gears the noise occurs, whether or not the noise changes as the transmission warms up, and whether the noise changes depending on the load on the gears. In diagnosing gear or bearing noise, it is helpful to remember that the main shaft turns in relation to road speed, while the counter shaft turns in relation to engine speed. By varying road and engine speeds, it is possible to narrow a diagnosis to either the main shaft, if the noise is car speed dependent, or the counter shaft if the noise is engine speed dependent. Also, in fourth gear, the gears on the main shaft are lightly loaded. A bad bearing or gear on the main shaft will tend to make less noise in fourth gear, and most noise if it is engaged and driving the car. If the transmission is diagnosed as being noisy, confirm the noise by raising the car on a hoist and listening to the transmission with a stethoscope. A noisy transmission will have to be dismantled for repair. The diagnosis should have been thorough enough to indicate the most likely gears involved. Inspect these gears closely if the damage is not obvious. Look for uneven wear patterns, pitting, or brinelling on bearing surfaces. During your inspection, you will look closely for wear throughout the transmission, and not just in the area which caused the original complaint. This is especially true if the transmission has been run without oil or been heavily abused. You should routinely inspect the following. The first area you will want to inspect on every disassembled 5-speed transmission is the depth the bearing cups have been pressed into the main housing. Refer to the reminder booklet with this program for the proper depths for the main shaft cup and cluster gear cups. If the cups have not been pressed into the proper depth, the bearing will rub against the input gears and cause noise and eventual destruction. The input needle bearing is heavily loaded. Inspect its races very closely for signs of wear. Similarly, the Torrington bearing and its thrust washer on the input drive gear is heavily loaded and should be closely inspected. Examine the wear patterns on the input drive gear and the input driven gear on the cluster shaft. If there are any signs of uneven wear, pitting, or other damage, the gears may need replacement. This damper plate is spring-loaded and attached to the input-driven gear on the cluster gear shaft on some 5-speed transmissions. If the plate is chipped or broken, it can cause neutral rattle or an audible noise when the engine is idling with the transmission in neutral. Not all 5-speed transmissions were fitted with this damper plate. It is non-serviceable and non-replaceable. If it is damaged, remove it. A noisy 5-speed transmission is diagnosed and repaired as any other transmission. However, these 5 points should be noted with special care during disassembly. Another category of complaints possibly experienced in the 5-speed transmission is hard shifting. Again, hard shifting complaints can be handled normally as with any other manual transmission, but there are several specific areas that require close inspection with the 5-speed gearbox. Before concluding that the transmission is at fault for hard shifting, always check clutch adjustment first. The proper pedal free travel is 1 inch to 1 1/4 inch. Also, check to see that the transmission is properly filled with the correct oil. If 90-weight gear lube is used, there may be a customer complaint of hard shifting. The 5-speed transmission uses automatic transmission fluid. If the transmission has been previously removed from the car and there appears to be clutch drag in spite of repeated clutch adjustments, it is possible that the input shaft may have been slightly bent, or its pilot bushing in the crankshaft may have been damaged. If either of these conditions exists, the transmission will shift as if the clutch is not fully disengaging. If the customer complaint is a hard shift combined with jumping out of gear, there is a possibility of linkage problems. Check that the pivot ball is properly attached and not worn. A worn pivot ball will reduce the actual motion of the shifting rails and cause the complaint of jumping out of gear and hard shifting. The shifter rails on the 5-speed transmission are sturdy stampings and are not likely to bend. However, if there is evidence of abuse and speed shifting, this possibility should be investigated. A customer complaint of a noisy shift may indicate either clutch problems or bad synchronizers. A complaint of hard shifting also may indicate bad synchronizers. In this case, if the synchronizer is bad, the hard shifting will probably be associated with only 1 or 2 gears, so diagnosis is simplified. The 5-speed transmission has shift forks fitted with nylon pads. If these pads are excessively worn or broken, they will cause hard shifting and a noisy shift when the fork pushes against the synchronizer sleeve. The fit of the fork on the synchronizer sleeve should be checked for a snug but not tight fit. During reassembly, check to see that a chamfer on the 2-3 clutch sleeve faces toward the front of the transmission. Early 5-speed transmissions had a chamfer on only one side of the clutch sleeve, and it must be installed facing forward. If the clutch sleeve is chamfered on only one side and improperly installed, the sleeve will rub against the cluster gear and cause a hard and noisy second gear shift. Also, because second gear will not fully engage, there could be a customer complaint of popping out of second gear. Assemble each of the synchronizers out of the transmission, checking for wear on the hub splines and the fit of the individual pieces. The pieces should slide together smoothly, but not loosely. Inspect the tapered part of the synchronizer blocker ring, the hub and sleeve. Abused transmissions will show blunted tapers and broken teeth. If the taper on the blocker ring, hub and sleeve is badly damaged, replace the part. Second gear takes most synchronizer abuse. A 1-2 shift on the 5-speed transmission involves selecting a different shift rail, and occasionally a missed shift results. Either fourth or reverse gear could be damaged severely, so on abused transmissions, check not only second gear synchronizers, but be especially careful in inspecting reverse and fourth gears as well. There is a special hard shifting complaint peculiar to the 5-speed transmission. It is a difficulty in shifting into the down positions, or gears 1, 3, and 5. The design of the 5-speed transmission is that the lower shift rail works in a lubricated blind bore. It is possible, under some circumstances, that a hydraulic lock will be formed in this bore, and the driver will not be able to move the shift rail against the compression of the oil trapped in the bore. The result is likely to be either a complaint of hard shifting or popping out of gear, but there will be no mechanical noises involved. Correction of this complaint involves removing the extension housing from the transmission. A hydraulic lock can be relieved by grinding a notch along the length of the shift rail and thus providing an exit for oil trapped in the blind bore. After the notch has been ground, be sure to clean the rail thoroughly so that the steel bits are not trapped in the box. Let's review for a moment the 4 main causes of customer complaints, which are common to all transmissions. Oil leaks around the case joints must be resealed after the joints have been thoroughly cleaned. A complaint of jumping out of gear will be caused by worn, broken, or improperly adjusted parts of the transmission. Jumping out of gear is most frequently caused by incomplete engagement. A complaint of noise is probably the result of worn or broken parts. Hard shifting may be the result of bad clutch adjustment, bent shift elements, or worn parts. In the 5-speed transmission, remember that under some conditions, the lower shift rail may form a hydraulic lock in its bore. Now let's consider some hints on the disassembly and assembly of the 5-speed transmission. The 5-speed transmission uses needle bearings exclusively and is assembled without paper gaskets. Instead, a formed-in-place gasket material is used. The combination of needle bearings and formed-in-place gaskets means that the transmission, unless properly handled, will come apart all at once and spill a lot of needle bearings. There is a danger in disassembly that the needle bearings for the main shaft and counter gear at the center section could be spilled and lost. We'll take a step-by-step approach to show the easiest method of disassembling the transmission with a minimum of difficulty. We begin by removing all of the bolts holding the 3 castings together. After the attaching bolts have been removed from the transmission, place the input shaft up against a sturdy object, such as your toolbox or the wall behind a table. Protect the pilot bearing if any force is used. Now use a plastic or rubber-headed mallet to tap the front casting along the input shaft. Only a slight bit of forward movement will be necessary to break the gasket seal of the transmission. After the seal has been broken, use your hands to ease the housing up to the end of the input shaft. With this approach, the needle bearings may fall out of their housings but not be lost. Since the needle bearings are not interchangeable between the main shaft and cluster gear shaft, their reassembly is simplified. The needle bearings are reassembled by being held in place with a heavy grease. Smear the grease on the inside of the bearing cup, and then place the needle bearings properly one by one in the grease. In all cases but one, the needle bearings will just fill the inner diameter of their retainer. Therefore, if there is any space between the needle bearings, you know that one or more is missing. The 5th gear bearing is properly assembled with 1 empty space per row. Do not try to fit an extra needle bearing into the 5th gear assembly to fill up this space. There should be 1 empty space in each of the needle bearing rows. The 5th gear spacer plate, like the needle bearings, should be held in place with heavy grease. During reassembly, it is possible for the spacer plate to fall down on the main shaft. If this happens, the synchronizer hub will not properly seat against the main shaft, and the transmission will not bolt together easily. If the 3 castings of the transmission do not press easily together on reassembly, the probable cause is that the 5th gear spacer plate has slipped down on the main shaft. Never try to draw the castings together by tightening the attaching bolts. If the spacer plate or any other part has slipped during reassembly and the transmission is drawn together using its bolts, the result will almost certainly be a locked-up transmission. Again, use only hand pressure to reassemble the casting halves. Lubricate all of the blind bores to ease reassembly. If the castings do not fit together easily during reassembly, pull the front and rear castings off and inspect the assembly, paying special attention to the 5th gear spacing washer. Re-grease the spacer washer to assure that it stays in place. Also, as a final check, make certain the 2-3 synchronizing sleeve has a chamfer facing forward. When you have determined the transmission will go together without excessive force, apply a bead of sealer to the mating surfaces of the castings and then push the castings together. Tighten the bolts to the specifications given in the Service and Overhaul Supplement for the 1975 Monza Town Coupe. While the front extension tube of the transmission is a press fit, if it is removed and replaced, it should be staked in place. In this program, we have covered some of the main diagnostic procedures for the 5-speed transmission. In the field, the 5-speed transmission has proved to be an extremely durable unit. Generally, its diagnosis and repair does not differ from any other manual transmission. The points covered in this film will help you quickly to repair the unit. For further information, refer to Update Program 75U5 for step-by-step disassembly and reassembly information. Also refer to the proper manual.